So welcome back. We're talking with Lynne Cockrum-Murphy about trauma and suffering. And before the break, Janet, you were asking Lynne a question about suffering.
Oh yeah, she had been talking before the break about how she had already done a good deal of the healing before she actually wrote the autobiography, and I'm just wondering if that is sort of a prerequisite almost to writing an autobiography, that you've already gone through the healing process, or is there value in doing it the other way around?
I think at whatever point a person is, if they feel inclined to write their story, to write about the powerful experiences in their life, positive and negative, both, that they should start.
Mm-hmm.
The key is only sharing it with people who are safe.
Mm-hmm.
Until, like I didn't put it out in the world until I had shared it with my sister, my husband, my writing coach, people in my writing group, etc. So that's very important. But I had already done therapy, particularly in my 20s, 30s, somewhere in there. I was strongly on my spiritual path. So those things might support a person and make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
But anytime you're ready to start, give it a go.
Right.
Great.
Yeah.
So I have a question. Given your experience and what's happening in the world, does suffering have a purpose?
Ooh. That's a big one. I think it does. For me, there's the immediate suffering and getting out of the circumstance. So for me, it was getting out of the house, fire, it was healing in the hospital, and moving on. But there's another level where suffering really compels us to move and to do something different and to either change our circumstances or change our life or even just change our mind. So you put your hand on a hot stove and you recoil, right?
Mm-hmm.
You take action immediately. And I find suffering is that way for me too. So some people might respond to it with margaritas on a regular basis. Other people might respond with meditation. Other people might respond through becoming a runner. A runner is a really powerful transformative tool. Clears the mind. So I find it's been an impetus to growth and change because I'm not willing to stay in the suffering. So even today, if I have something disconcerting come up and weigh on my mind, then I'm going to look for solutions. I've got a lot of tools, and there are more tools than what I use. So I'm going to look for solutions and move into that space of, I don't have to suffer. I don't think anybody does. And I think I use the word suffering because I studied Buddhism for so long. And the Buddha talked about suffering, that it's just a condition living on earth. Having the human experience means you're going to suffer.
Mm-hmm.
So he offers the path to enlightenment. And I encourage, in the meantime, use some of these tools that are in the book.
Right.
So you don't suffer so much.
So I have a question kind of based on what the initial part of your answer was, because I've had experiences and I know other people have had experiences as well, where they're stuck or they're not paying attention, and then an accident happens to kind of trigger something to get them moving forward. Given your experiences, because there's been so many different types of events that have taken place for you, do you see what's taken place with you as something similar to someone having an accident, like getting rear-ended? So
like a wake-up call, is that what you mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Do you see what's taken place with you in that light, or are you looking at it from a different perspective?
I think it's pretty complex because things like the house fire, that was not a nudge. That was burning off.
No, that was, that initial one was
huge.
But later on in life, the things that have happened to you, do you see them as like trying to push you forward and opening up to who you are? Or I'm just wondering.
I think that life presents itself with many an impetus for change. one of the things that I think I write about it in this book, In Living Hope, that you can get a nudge, like you mentioned, and you can ignore it, and you'll get another nudge.
Sure.
And if you wait too long to make those changes, you get a 2x4.
Exactly.
Or the house falls on your head.
Yeah. So I really encourage people to try to pay attention earlier on and ask someone, what are those dreams about? What was this that popped up in my meditation? Why do people always say so-and-so to me? So that they can make the change now and not wait for the 2x4.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. Now, you refer to suffering as illusion. Can you explain that?
That's a spiritual concept, and it's based upon decades of meditation, and that there's a space that you go to in meditation that there is no suffering. Those deeper meditations, there is stillness and peace, and no questions, there are no problems. There's unity with whatever that consciousness is that we're part of. There's awareness. Suffering doesn't exist. I think that suffering exists here on this planet, maybe in other dimensions too, but definitely here. And that one of the ways out of that is change of perspective and finding that still place inside where nothing else really matters.
Calm, peace, and serenity exists, irregardless of what's going on in the outer world.
Right. In fact, sometimes I think when I'm meditating, why do I ever get out of my chair? This is pretty cool. Like maybe I should just stay here.
Yeah.
And it's curious to me because I always have questions about life and I want to understand things and so on. But in meditation, those questions dissolve. And I'll think, you were going to meditate today on so-and-so because you wanted some insight. But I can barely remember what the topic was.
I'd like to parse something out here. Because I know a little bit about Buddhism. And I know, like you mentioned earlier, Lynn, when Buddhists teach that, or the teaching is that the moment that you're born, suffering begins and it ends when you transition out of your body. Now, how does that equate to what you're talking about in your book, where you suffer with PTSD? Because there's like a whole spectrum. I mean, of suffering that could occur based on the Buddhist teaching, right? I'm not sure if there's a question in there for you or not, but I think that, you wrote this book about people with PTSD and depression and major traumatic events that have happened in one's life. And you can say, well, that's suffering. But then on the flip side, just existing, if you just sat in your chair and meditated your whole life, supposedly, according to the Buddhist teaching, that there's suffering in that somewhere. So how do you parse that out as far as what you wrote about in your book versus just being born into a body and now you're suffering?
Okay, so suffering's going to happen, according to the Buddhist philosophy, no matter what. And then I've found that karma created circumstances that really intensified that suffering. So there's different levels, right? And then I like to focus on the way out of the suffering. So for me, it's been the use of a spiritual path, seeking, questioning, allowing myself to be loved, surrendering, etc., besides the other ways mentioned in the book, so that I have a greater degree of peace than I ever had. And anytime I sit down or pause long enough to connect with Source and remember who I really am, then the suffering ceases. So I don't have the enlightenment that Buddha talks about, but I certainly have something that's on that path that makes it great enough that I'm willing to write a book and talk about it and encourage people to find their own way there.
That's great. Thank you.
I'm trying to remember there was a complete saying that I just cannot remember the rest of it, but part of it was that suffering is optional.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember anything like that, Roger? Or
I don't remember that, no.
Something, that suffering is optional. Is it really, though?
I think, when you're in the midst of the car accident, no.
Yeah.
When the doctor's resetting your bone in the hospital, maybe not. But then it's what you do with it after that. So I could remain in the victim mentality. I could have intensified the PTSD symptoms if I had chosen a violent marriage, if I had chosen to live on the streets and use meth. But I didn't choose any of those things because suffering really is optional, and I can choose different.
Absolutely.
It occurs to me that maybe in the moment of something happening, an accident, a trauma, a rape, whatever it is, that there isn't suffering in that moment, that might be something that's the effect of the accident or trauma, that once the mind gets involved and says, why did this have to happen to me? That's maybe where the suffering comes in.
Right, because good point. Because in the midst of the trauma, you're just surviving. You're just trying to make sure that you live through it, and maybe thinking at the same time something about it. But it's afterwards, and I think that's why many of the religions tell us to stop thinking and to get into a space of knowing or of wisdom, because in our thinking we tend to go in circles and not necessarily help ourselves a lot. I mean, it depends on the kind of thinking, but in general, there's something to that. It gets in our way.
Yeah.
Yes, it does. And then it causes car accidents.
Or you drop a saw on your foot or whatever it was you did earlier today.
Right.
I do a type of astrology called human design, and in the head, there's a lot of energy that goes through different gates or channels, and we call those gates the gates of madness, because it is that process of those thoughts that continually go round and round, like the rat or the mouse on the hamster wheel. I guess it would be a hamster.
The hamster and the hamster wheel.
Rat race, mouse on the whatever. You know what I'm saying? That we go round and round with our thoughts, and we can keep creating the pain by basically thinking. We're not, we can almost re-experience it every day, which is, I guess, what PTSD is essentially, right?
Ooh, perseverating on whatever it was that happened. With PTSD, I think you really can't help but relive it, have it show up in your nightmares. And I had this happen just the other day. It was stunned me. So I was sitting next to a fireplace, and someone lit the gas jet so that the little flames would pop up. And just that sound took me, over 5 minutes to calm down and get that little jolt out of my body.
Wow.
So that's one of the symptoms.
And you were only 2 when this fire happened.
Yeah.
I mean, how long has that stayed with you?
Mm-hmm.
Of course, I know you had an experience with a fire some other time in your life, I think, right, in the book.
Oh, we lived in a house when I was in 1st and 2nd grade that the fireplace had wooden boards under the bricks. And so when the bricks crackled and broke apart, then the wood underneath it caught on fire and just smoldered.
Oh.
And so we moved out of that house immediately. And my stepdad, my sister's dad, said, no, they fixed it. We can live here. We don't have to have any fire. My mom said, no way.
Not me.
Don't blame you.
Yeah, so that was one of the other.
Oh, nice. Well, I think it's time for us to take a break. And when we come back from the break, Lynne, I'd like to talk about some of the action steps that you talk about in the book as far as how people can start to overcome suffering. So we will be right back.